Good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to a new chapter. Perhaps not. Second. Yeah, I think so.
Yes, it's a new chapter.
Okay. Thank you. There was just one more thing I wanted to say here regarding haircuts, on Erev Shabbat. So it says in the Tur, Bit Yosef, I'm sorry. כתב הכובע סימן נ"ח, says the כובע, נראה שאסור מספר ישראל בערב שבתות בימים טובים, מנחה למעלה, ואפשר להתיר בתספורת מעשה אדיוט, right? So we said, right, that you shouldn't get a haircut from a Jew on Erev Shabbat, Erev Yom Tov, from time Mincha onwards. And so he says, but we can allow that if we do it like, amateur. Yeah, we said this already yesterday also, but just wanted to point that out. That the lo gara michol moed. So it says nothing less than chol moed. Taminan hediot tofer kedarko. That we say, right, that the amateur can do it. That's very interesting, because according to this, what he's saying here, it would be allowed to do on chol moed a haircut in an amateur way. But in the laws of chol moed, it's not brought down. So that's interesting. We got to look into that. All right, that's interesting. So he says we're lenient about that. That's very interesting. Wow, yeah, that's pretty clear. But according to this, it would be allowed to do like a amateur haircut. So in other words, you get your machine out, right? Then let the machine do your haircut. That's amateur. Okay, very interesting. All right, we'll see. I don't know. Never heard that this is the halacha, but we gotta look into it. We'll look into that. Okay. So we'll move on to the next chapter, Reish Nun Bet. Just see what it says in Shulchan Aruch about this. Right, so the Ramah here brings down regarding that Mistaprin kol hayom afilu misapar Israel. He says over here that you're allowed to actually get a haircut from a Jew all day on Friday. But we just saw that it's not allowed. So how is that? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here and what it says. Right, so he says what I thought yesterday, which is that the reason why they allow this is because it's a mitzvah, to get a haircut before Shabbat. It says Mishnah Berurah that applies even if he's taking a wage for that. He's taking a fee. That's very interesting. Maybe we should look at the Yalkut Yosef, see what he says about this. Mishnun Aleph. So he says here, like the Ramah, right, that it's allowed all day because of the fact that it's a mitzvah. And he says, even according to the Kabbalah. So that's a little bit helpful to know that. Okay, that's great. So What else? He brings another thing here, which is very, very interesting, which is that he says that, there's as we said, right, you're not allowed to do labor, but he says when it comes to, buying and selling, it's commerce, stores, things like this, right? So there he says the custom is to be lenient because it's not really considered to be labor, buying and selling. That's also very interesting. So he says we allow you to do that until 20 minutes before sunset, right? When you light the candles. Wow. So that would mean that, a person could keep his store open, pretty late. If he really wants to, to sell stuff, and that would be okay according to this. Wow. What they do, a lot of stores, Jewish stores, they keep a store open very late, Erev Shabbat. But what they do is, the Jews go home like earlier, and then the Goyim operate the store, like until like close to sunset. And then they close it down. So the store remains open like, all day, pretty much. There are some stores like that. But in Israel, the custom is not like that. In Israel, the custom is that they close very early. The stores, like 3 o'clock, 3 p.m. They're closing already. But some stores do remain open, you can find a couple here and there. All right, that's great. That helps us a little bit. So if that's the case, that it's allowed to get a haircut all day. So then what's the story with the Bet Yosef? How do we fit that in? Let's see one more time the Bet Yosef. Right. So the way the Ramah understands the Bet Yosef, very interesting, right? Is that in the end, the Bet Yosef says that the custom is to be lenient. So what does that mean? It's the custom is to be lenient all day, right? And even from a professional barber. That's the way he understands it. So if that's the case, then we understand why the Ramah says what he says. And also the Yalkut Yosef, same thing. So therefore, but we would allow, to get a haircut on Friday all day. That's the halacha. And that would, also include the ladies, that they could go get their hair done on Friday, that would be the case. All right, sounds good.
Perfect.
Yeah, even though the ladies take a long time, but it's okay, I mean, halacha is halacha. Sometimes they take like 2 hours, the ladies. I don't know, God knows. Okay. The men, they do it in a half hour. It's the whole thing is over. Okay, it's all good. Let's go to the next one. I just want to I wanted to get that clarified before we went on. Okay, so it is an important halakha. So we'll go to Reish Nun Bet. Says the tour like this. מותר להתחיל במלאכה בערב שבת סמוך לחשיכה. So this is an important halakha brought down in the Talmud. So what is it saying here? That if a person wants to start some kind of a labor, Erev Shabbat, and let it go by itself, it's just self-sufficient, it goes by itself. So he can do that, even though it's going to finish on Shabbat, the labor, by itself, but it's allowed since you started on Erev Shabbat and you just left it, to go by itself. So apparently this is allowed. There are, many things that go like this, where, you start and, it just goes by itself and keeps on going. For instance, when it comes to cooking and also, but sorry, it's the wrong place. One sec. Yeah, so another example would be, if you're like watering your lawn, so you start it like on Friday and it just goes on, for let's say an hour and goes into Shabbat. And then, the clock will turn it off automatically. The timer, will turn it off. So that would also be fine because, we started it before. Same idea. So things like this are allowed. Even though there's a machloket in the Talmud about this, but the halacha is that it's allowed. Okay, fine. אף על פי שאינו יכול לגומרה בעוד יום, והיא נגמרת מעליה בשבת, וכגון לשרות דאו סמנין. Right, so he gives another example, which is, let's say you're dyeing, you're doing some dyeing. So what does that mean? You take like a cauldron and you put some dye in there, and you take like some, clothing and put it in to dye it. So it'll start, like before Shabbat, and it'll keep going. And once it's done, it's done. That's it, right? It'll stop by itself. But it's going to be on Shabbat, which is okay. Okay, what else we got? So it says, Another thing he mentions, another example, he says, "Latet onin shel pishtan letanur," to put some flax into the oven, kedei sheylitlabnu, in order, right, that it should get whitened, right? V'latet semer latoch hayore, also to put wool inside the cauldron, sheno al gabe ash, which is not on the fire, but toche batit, and then he seals it up with clay. Avalim aita al aesh asu, but if it's on the fire, it's forbidden. Shemay yechateh, because we're afraid he's going to stir the pot, the kichalim. Right? He's going to not stir the pot; he's going to stir the coals. Well, afilu ena ela esh. This is also, even if it's not on the fire, im hi petucha, if it's open, asu, it's forbidden. Shemay agisba, because we may stir it, as we said, right? You may stir it. Okay. Cuff with a spoon. So as if you stir the pot, even though it's not on the fire, chayav mishum bevashel. You're cooking, you're liable for that. So why is that? Because when you stir the pot, the temperature goes up, and that makes it cook better, cook faster, whatever. This is the reason why. Another thing he mentions is mutar lifros metzudot chayam the ofet dagim. You're allowed to set a trap, on Friday, that some animal should be trapped in there, or some right fish or a bird. Then nitzodim b'Shabbat. They're going to get trapped in there, but it's automatic, you're not doing anything. Mutar limkor leakum ulatino samuch lechashecha. Another thing is that, let's say you're selling some merchandise to a goy, and you're loading up his shoulder right before it gets Shabbat, darkness. He has to leave his house before Shabbat comes in. Then it will be fine. Okay, great. Also, right, as we said before, we mentioned this a couple of times, you're allowed to give your clothing, right, to a dry cleaner, or to a launderer, the laundry, and they're going to do it on Shabbat. You're not telling them to do it on Shabbat, but you're giving it to them right before Shabbat. So, yeah. But nevertheless, it's allowed. Also, giving the leather, the hides, to the tanner, right before sunset. As long as there's a set price. But if you didn't set the price, forbidden. Unless it's Wednesday, or b'yom hey, or Thursday. Okay, I'm reading a lot here, so let me go to Beit Yosef and see what we got before we finish the whole tour over here. So says the Beit Yosef, so he says it's understood from the laws we're going to learn, right, close by, the ifligu Bet Shammai u Bet Hillel, right, that there's a classic machloket here between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel regarding this issue about starting a labor and letting it finish by itself. Perek Kama the Shabbat, first perek of Shabbat, Yud Zayin Amud Bet. The Bet Hillel sharu lishot deyo v'samanim. So it says Bet Hillel allows to soak the ink, right, and the herbs, and the tetotam l'shul pishtan, and also to put this flax, the tanur, into the oven, the tzemer leore, or to put wool into the cauldron, v'lifros metzudot, also, right, to set a trap, to trap an animal. And to sell to a goy, and then load him up and let him leave. or to give right your clothing to a launderer, nochri, which was a goy, beorot leovdan, or to give the hides to the tanner. Bet Shammai asre. So Bet Shammai forbids this. Kaimalan ke Bet Hillel. So he says we hold like Bet Hillel. Ve'aliba de Rabbi Akiva, and according to Rabbi Akiva, the Amar the lo ba'u Bet Hillel kadesh yagia lebet hasamuch lechoma. Who says that Bet Hillel doesn't even require you should get to the right house which is close to the wall. Only just to leave the house of the Jew. That's enough. Before Shabbat, Shara, it's allowed. Okay, good. What else we got here? Almost done. So then it continues. ומה שיתנה בצמר ליורה שלא תהא על גבי האש. And now what the Torah said, right, that regarding the wool which goes into the cauldron, that should be on the fire, the sheteheh toche batit, and also you should be lining it with the clay. Hachi ol kamua b'gimara. That's what it says in the Gemara. Okay, very good. So let's see Shulchan Aruch. We gotta bring it up. Okay. So it says here, "Mutar le'atchil b'melacha be'erev Shabbat samuch lechashecha." You're allowed to begin the labor, as we said, erev Shabbat, before dark. Even though you cannot finish it right before Shabbat. And it's going to finish by itself, go by itself automatically. Kegon, right? What are the examples? As we said, Lishot deo b'samanim, right? To put dye into the cauldron and boil it up and color like that. It's going to be soaking all Shabbat. Also to put the flax, bundles of flax, the tanur, into the oven, right, in order that it should whiten. Also to put wool inside the cauldron, which is not on the fire, and he lines it with clay. Because if it's going to be on the fire, asur shema yechatet. It's going to be forbidden. Why? Because he may come to stir it. Right. What does that mean? Stir the coals. Even if it's not on the fire, if he doesn't line it with with clay, it's forbidden, asur. Shema yagis ba b'kaf. Why? Because you may come to stir it with a spoon. והמגיס בקדרה, אפילו אינה על האש, חייב. So a person who stirs the spoon, even though it's not on the fire, he's still liable for that on Shabbat. משום מבשל. Why? Because he's cooking like that. So let's just get this straight, right? What are we talking about here? Why does this have all kinds of conditions and provisions that the other examples don't have? What's the reason for that? So let's explain that. The reason is like this. We're talking here about somebody who's putting wool inside a cauldron to dye it. Now here's the problem, right? Tells you Shulchan Aruch here, in order to do this, you need two conditions. One is that it shouldn't be on the fire. Why? Because if it is, you may come to stir the coals, right? And by the way, this is the reason why when we're, eating hot food on Shabbat, we don't want to have it on the open flame. We want to have it, on a plata or on a blech, because then the fire is covered. So that reminds you not to turn it up. So same thing here, since you're cooking in a cauldron, it's the same thing like cooking food. So therefore, we want two conditions, right? One is that don't have it directly on the fire, because then you may come to stir the coals and raise it up. So you'll be lighting a fire like that. Number two, also we said, right? Make sure you line it with clay and cover it like that. Why? Because that will remind you, right, not to stir it. Because otherwise you may stir it, and if you stir it, even though it's not on the fire, it's still, you're heating it up, and therefore you're cooking like that. You're adding the cooking. You're cooking more intensely. So therefore, right, we don't allow that. So we need two conditions in order to do this. But when it comes to the other labors, which don't have these characteristics, right? So there we don't really need special conditions, because we're not really afraid of anything. There's no concern that he may come to do this or come to do that. That's the whole thing. So now goes to the next example. You're allowed to set a trap, to trap an animal, a bird, fish, whatever it may be. And they get trapped automatically because it's already set before Shabbat. That's also allowed. Same thing also to sell merchandise to a goy and to load him up, on his shoulder and let him go. Leave your house. So, but what's the condition? But one condition, right? He has to leave your house before Shabbat comes in, because otherwise it looks suspicious. It looks like you're telling him to do it on Shabbat, even though you're not telling him to do it. Right? You already sold it to him. It doesn't belong to you anymore. So therefore, right, the proper thing to do in a case like that, let him go before Shabbat. This way there won't be any concerns. Okay, great. So what else we got here? There's a Ramah. So says the Ramah, "V'yesh matirim sheyotzi ha'enu Yehudi b'Shabbat im yiched lo ha'enu Yehudi makom be'od yom b'Beit Yisrael." Right. So there is an opinion that allows, right, for the goy to remove the merchandise on Shabbat. How is that? if you designated a place for him, like a corner in your house for that merchandise. So he says the Ramah, but proper to be stringent about this. And definitely, right, we should be stringent because Shulchan Aruch doesn't even bring this leniency, right? So therefore, we should be stringent and not do this. So therefore, the rule is, if you're selling something to a goy, erev Shabbat, he should leave your house before Shabbat, right? Therefore, there won't be any concerns, suspicions, or anything like that. Okay, great. So we can try another one. We got time. All right, so we're continuing with what we said in the tour, that you're giving your clothing to the launderer right before Shabbat, and he can do whatever he wants. Right, he can do it on Shabbat if he wants. Who cares? So regarding this, says Bet Yosef, Ken Katu Shama Tosfot. That's what it says in Tosfot. The Arosh Gabe Ahad Tan Rabbanan, and also the Rosh regarding what the rabbis taught, and Meshalachin Igrot Biyad Goy. We don't send letters in the hands of a goy. So meaning what? We don't use the goy as our courier on Shabbat. Again, Katav Ran. That's what it says in Ran. Matlitin the Chulan Betilel. Right. So he writes this to Ran in the Mishnah. Matirin im Hashemesh, that we allow this right before sunset. That's what it says in Rambam also. Katav Rav Magid shehu nilmad midin. Says Rav Magid. It's learned. We learn this from what? Didn't I get it from the din of the letter, as we said, right? We already learned this in chapter 147. But shelo kedivri agaot Mordechai. Not like this, Rabbi. Shkatu sham b'shem atosod. Who said the name atosod? The kli lechobes umtinat or leovdan mistama hainu kitzitza. They say that when you give a utensil to in other words, clothing to a launderer, or you give the leather, the hides, to the tanner, he says this is already considered like you fixed the price. Sheno oseh bechinam, because you won't do it for free. The Talmud de Mainan Katzatz. So then, why do we require that he should have a fixed price? Because if he doesn't have a fixed price, it looks like he's doing it for the Jew. He's working for the Jew. And he gives it to Erev Shabbat. So it looks like he's doing it for the Jew. On Shabbat. The Katzatz goy, right? But when the goy sets a price, when he's doing it for himself. To take his wages, right? And he doesn't look like he's the agent of the Jew. Okay, great. So it says even though he set a price, it's only allowed that the goy is doing it right on his own volition, the labor. But you're not allowed to tell him to do it on Shabbat. We already mentioned that before. That's what it says in Samag. We have Truma and also Truma. Also, this rabbi says, the Siman Reish Mem Zayin, this chapter, the Shem Harashba, name of the Rashba. וכן כתוב בכל בו, also כל בו. כתוב ברוקח, בשם ירושלמי, it says in רוקח, name ירושלמי, שאם נתן כלים לכובס, if he gave, right, clothing, right, to the launderer, נוכרי, and he's a goy, וראה הוא עושה בהם בשבת, he saw them doing it on Shabbat, צריך למחות בו, he would have to object against that, בידו. אלא אם כן קצץ, unless he made a set price, ותמה מדגרסינא בירושלמי, so he says the reason is because it says in Yerushalmi, so perek kama the Shabbat, first perek of Shabbat, at the end, Natan kelav lekoles, says there, if he gave his clothing to a launderer, nochri is a goy, umi ubao metzao oved bo b'Shabbat, and he found him he's doing it on Shabbat. Asur, it's forbidden. Amar Rav Yudan v'en marle. So this rabbi says, right, why don't you just tell him the law, Yavid, you shouldn't do it. Tell him like that. Amar Rav Yudan avoy de Rabbi matnia hadad tema betuvat hana. So he says that means to say that he's doing it, as a favor. About beschir beavite asik. But he says when he's a hired worker though, he's doing it by his own labor. Katuv agot Mordechai. It says in this rabbi per kama about yesh ditmoa. But it says there is a wonderment here al arokach regarding this rabbi shkatab ela im ken katzatz. He says unless he set a price. The mashma de afilu be'oseh besachar. That implies, right, that even if he does it for a wage, kamar, he's regarding that. He's referring to that also. You have to object against him. So he says perhaps we should say dachi kamar. It means to say like this: unless he does it for a wage, katzatz, and he set a price. Okay, great. There's more here, but you'll set one more piece here somewhere. This one. Okay, let's see if we can do this. We got time. We got 5 minutes. So it says, Mash katav, that what you wrote, Rabbeinu ela inken b'yom Revi'i or b'yom Chamishi. But the Torah said, right, you can give it to him on Wednesday and Thursday. Regarding the laundry, right? That's no problem. In other words, even if you didn't set a price. By us, when we go to the laundry, it's always a set price, They give you like a price, They give you a receipt, right? So it's always a set price. So for us, it's more lenient in our times. Because nobody will do your laundry unless you set a price. It's as simple as that. Unless it's your wife or whatever, or your daughter, or your mother. Otherwise, nobody will do it. Okay. So let's see the Bet Yosef. Ken katav Rosh. It says in Rosh like that. But can't come in the Shabbat. First paragraph of Shabbat. Gabe en meshalchin igrot, right, regarding sending letters. The orot leovdan. Right, regarding the hides for the tanner, the kelim kobes, and also the clothing for the launderer. That you're allowed to give it on Wednesday and Thursday, even though there's no price. So he says that was already explained in this chapter, right? 247. That the Ran holds like that. The Gabe you get regarding letters. So it implies, right, that's also the same applies as well for the hides for the tanner, the kelim, the koves, or for the laundry, right, all that stuff. The maishana, because what's the difference? So he says they're all the same. They're all variations on the same theme. So he says I already wrote there. The end data Rif and Rambam can. The Rif and the Rambam don't hold like that. They require that there should be a set price even on Wednesday and Thursday. Right. That's interesting. Okay. It says this rabbi, this rabbi, when we allow, right, to do a set price in the house of the goy, right? Dafka besachar, that's only when you're paying him. But if it's for free, he says forbidden. Asur litno lo, you're not allowed to give it to him. Be'erev Shabbat, Erev Shabbat. Ela im ken, unless yadua sheyachol legomra kodem chashicha. Unless it's known that he can finish it before it gets dark. Then it says it doesn't seem like this from this rabbi. That we wrote that was close by. So that's the way it says more plausible. That even though it's for free, it's still, we can still say, right, that he's doing it for himself. Why? Because he's doing him a favor in order that he should return the favor one day, as we said before, right? We spoke about that already one time. This is, I already wrote this in chapter, right, 247, as I mentioned. Okay, very beautiful. Okay, let's see Shulchan Aruch and we're done. So, says Shulchan Aruch, you're allowed to give, right, your clothing to the laundry, right, which is a goy, right, your Chinese laundry, right, and ve'orot le'avdan, and also hides for the tanner, samuch lechashicha, right before darkness, right before sunset, im katzatz lo damim, as long as there's a set price. Or she'oseh otam betuvatana, or he's doing it as a favor, but you shouldn't tell him la'asot b'Shabbat. Don't tell him to do it on Shabbat. That's not allowed. וגם שיעשה אינו יהודי המלאכה בביתו. And also, right, the goy should be doing the labor in his house. In other words, on his premises, right? It could be also in his store. Same thing. So it says Ramah here, Haga ve'im lo katzatz. So it says, if he didn't make a set price, says the Ramah, asur, it's not allowed, Be'erev Shabbat, on Friday, right? That's for sure. And as we said in the Bet Yosef, the Rif and the Rambam forbid this even on Thursday and Wednesday and Thursday. As we said, right? Look over there, he says, the Ramah in 247, that there are those who argue with this. If he's doing it for free. As a favor. We just saw that right now. So if we saw him doing his labor on Shabbat, right? In other words, doing his laundry, right, of the Jew. If he's doing it as a favor, so then we got to tell him not to do it on Shabbat, right? We got to object against that. So it says the Ramah, even if you give it to him several days before Shabbat. Right. So in other words, the general rule is, if you see him doing it on Shabbat, you got to tell him, please, don't do it on Shabbat. This is the general rule, right? Regardless of the conditions. Okay, beautiful. So I guess we'll stop there. Beautiful, fantastic. Chazak u'baruch, Laila Tov, Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you B'ezrat Hashem on Sunday.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless. All the best.